G'day, this is Professor Joseph Drew from the University of Technology, Sydney, and I'm back to talk to you today, this time about the financial performance of Cootamundra-Gundagai Council, financial performance prior to amalgamation, what was projected at the time of amalgamation and what's happened since. Once again, I'm just setting out facts so that people have the correct information to base their decisions on. So prior to the amalgamation, some of you will be aware that the New South Wales Treasury Corporation, TCorp, did a financial sustainability review of all of the New South Wales local governments. It wasn't a particularly good review. It was heavily criticised in the scholarly literature with good reason. However, it's all we have. Basically, they looked at a number of financial ratios and on the basis of that decided whether the council was sustainable or fit for the future. So this is what they said about Cootamundra, that we consider council to be in a satisfactory financial position. This is just a cut and paste out of the last page of their document. Satisfactory is not a word they ended up using towards the end, but basically it seems to suggest that they had 7 different ratings, 3 different bands. It was in the 3rd band, just above the middle band. So what they're saying was Cootamundra was fit for the future. So we look at Gundagai, and they also had a review. They came out as moderate. Moderate was the ranking below satisfactory. It was a moderate council is above 25% of the rest of the local governments in the area, and it was considered, it was that middle band, it was considered to be sustainable. So the actual words, they say we consider council to be moderately sustainable in the short term. They did express some concerns about the long term. So on the basis of those TCorp financial assessments and some work that the councils had to do, eventually our voluntary amalgamation program became a compulsory amalgamation program. To start that off under the legislation, the Minister needs to do a proposal. This is his proposal of January 2016. It took us all by shock. I don't think anyone was expecting this particular configuration, particularly when Cootamundra had done so much work with Hardin. And these are cuts and pastes from the report or the Minister's proposal. Now, I should point out, if you don't already know, there's good reason to think that KPMG, who is one of the big 4 accounting firms in the world, actually wrote the Minister's proposal. It transpired in court that they had people in the office working on this document, and it was heavily based on KPMG's work. Now, as I said, they are one of the big 4 accounting firms in the world. They have a very strong brand. Doesn't mean the quality of their work was strong. It was heavily criticised in the scholarly literature. It was criticised in court and it was criticised in the media. It was pretty ordinary, to tell you the truth. Okay, but this is what they said, and this is what the Boundaries Commission made the decision. They relied heavily on this work. They said that the merger between Cootamundra and Gundagai is expected to lead to more than $3 million in net financial savings over 20 years. The headline figure they used was $18 million, but of course, as most of you are aware, that $18 million included $15 million of grants. Initially $5 million to cover the cost of amalgamation, which wasn't enough, and another $10 million for the Stronger Community Funds, which was a way of rewarding communities for being amalgamated by providing them with new infrastructure. So $3 million over 20 years was what was supposed to be saved, and you read down further in the report and it says, on average, expected to generate on average around $400,000 in savings every year from 2020, which is this coming financial year onwards. So where were these savings supposed to come from? Read further into the report and it tells you. Most of the savings were supposed to be in the area of employee costs. So streamlining senior management roles was meant to save $4 million. Now, a lot of you will be aware that we actually have more senior management roles in Cootamundra-Gundagai Council than the sum of the ones that previously existed in Cootamundra and Gundagai when they were separate. Now, that is actually consistent with the Boundaries Commissioner's recommendations. He said that the councils, because they weren't linked, weren't close together and they weren't linked by a good, reliable highway, that they'd have to effectively be run as two separate halves, one in the north and one in the south, and that would require extra layers of management to coordinate that. So it's hard to understand how people thought there would be savings when they knew that there would actually need to be extra management. There was supposed to be redeployment of back office and admin functions, and that was supposed to save another $3 million in employee costs. So all up, $7 million in employee costs is supposed to be saved over 20 years. And efficiencies generated through increased purchasing power of materials and contracts, which is a special item on your accounting statements. $500,000 was supposed to be saved there. All these savings were supposed to go towards reducing the existing $12 million infrastructure backlog that existed combined between those two councils prior to amalgamation. So we now know what the situation was prior to amalgamation. Both councils were fit for the future. We now know what KPMG and the Minister were saying would happen due to amalgamation. There'd be quite considerable savings, $3 million over 20 years, and winding back the backlog and saving huge amounts of money in employee costs and materials and contracts. So we can now go to the actual financial statements and see what happened. So if you look at these statements, down the bottom here I have the years 2012, 2013, 2014, etc. and their financial years. The orange line is Gundagai's expenditure. The blue line is Cootamundra's expenditure. And all I've done is simply add them together to get the grey line, which is the combined expenditure for the two councils prior to amalgamation. That little dotty line you can see that goes down here, that's what we call a trend line. It just gives you an idea of which way things were trending, and it seems like expenditure was trending down. Now I need to point out that in 2016 and 2017 things are a little bit different to normal. 2016, the financial year actually finished in May when the amalgamations occurred, about a month and a half earlier than normal. Normally the financial year finishes 30th of June. Now because of that it was a month and a half shorter, roughly 1/12 less expenditure than what would normally occur. 2017, of course, we had an extra month and a half, so the expenditure was roughly 1/12 more than what we would normally expect to incur. So those 2 years are hard to compare, 2016 and 2017. So when you're comparing, you're better off looking at full normal financial years like 2014, 2015, and compare them to years like 2018 and 2019. Now, I think it's quite clear from here that the total expenditure didn't reduce by $400,000 per year. It's actually gone up quite considerably. These dollar amounts here on the side are in thousands of dollars because that's what the financial statements are in. So we've roughly moved up from expenditure in the order of $25 million a year, $27 million a year, up to about $40 million a year. So it's gone up quite considerably. Now recall KPMG said most of the savings would be in employee costs. So if we compare 2015, 2014, when the employee costs were around $9 million, they're now sitting just over the $12 million mark. So we haven't saved money in employee costs. It actually appears to be costing us an extra $3 million or so per year. Materials and contracts was the other area that KPMG told us we would save a lot of money in. As you can see, it was trending downwards prior to amalgamation. Since amalgamation, it has jumped up quite alarmingly, almost doubled in fact. So it doesn't appear that the prediction of savings in materials and contracts was correct either. Now, the combined outcome of this is the net operating result. So the net operating result is simply your revenues less your expenditure. If it's negative, you've got a deficit. So it was trending up, which is a good thing. Prior to amalgamation, and the operating result was getting stronger every year, better surpluses every year. Since amalgamation, it's been all over the place. It's been up remarkably, then down remarkably, then up again remarkably. There is no trend there. It's hard to say what's happened. So, as I said previously, TCorp looked at a number of financial ratios, and that's essentially what ended up being used to decide if a council was fit for the future, and hence decide if a council had to be amalgamated. So we can go back and look at the same ratios. Once again, we combine the councils prior to amalgamation to get a combined ratio in 2014, 15, 16. And then we look at the ratio for the new Cootamundra-Gundagai Regional Council for the years 2017, 18 and 19. Now, in these graphs, the orange line is the benchmark. For all but one of these graphs, you had to be above the benchmark to be considered fit for the future. If you were below benchmark in any of the ratios, you were considered unfit for the future and you were considered a likely candidate for amalgamation. So we can see since amalgamation, the operating ratio did go down a little bit initially, then it went down a lot in 2018, and now it's just above the benchmark again. It is quite chaotic. Now, I should also mention this benchmark has been changed at one stage. So initially it was negative 4%, now it's zero break even. So if we went by the new benchmark, it's not meeting the benchmark at all. Own source ratio was never a good ratio. It showed a gross ignorance of fiscal federalism and the intergovernmental grant system and the objectives of the system. But nevertheless, it was a ratio that was used to decide whether these councils should be amalgamated or not, and it's a ratio that is still measured. So we can see that since amalgamation, it's been mostly under the benchmark. Prior to amalgamation, it was above the benchmark. Unrestricted current ratio, well above the benchmark still, but we're trending down. Debt service ratio, mostly above the benchmark, but we weren't in 2018, and it's certainly trending down. Cash expense ratio, well above the benchmark. There's this spike in 2016, this is all the grant money coming in, but it's trending down. The renewals ratio, it's below the benchmark and has been since amalgamation, although it was below the benchmark prior to amalgamation. The infrastructure backlog ratio, this is the one graph that's back to front. In this graph, to meet the benchmark, you need to be under the orange line. So you can see since amalgamation, it's been above the orange line. Therefore, it's not fit for the future in terms of the old rating system. Asset management ratio, I put in 1,000 here because in the last two financial reports, councils claim that they have no required annual maintenance that hasn't been done. That needs to be investigated further. By this ratio, by the figures in the current audited financial statements, you would have to say that it's been a huge success in terms of asset maintenance. Cost to bring assets to a satisfactory standard. This figure essentially says what needs to be spent in terms of money to get things right. So in 2018, roughly $25 million the council claimed needed to be spent on their assets. Now, there's been lots in the scholarly literature and in the media about how reliable these figures are. Certainly in terms of other councils, I can't speak for this council, I haven't examined it closely enough yet. There's good cause not to think they're terribly reliable figures. If you took the figures just at face value, it seems like things have got way, way worse. We've gone from having to spend about $5 million to get things up to scratch, to the situation where we now have to spend about $25 million to get things up to scratch. Okay, so thank you very much for your time. Hopefully I provided you with more facts so you can make good decisions. So the decision makers, your council and the Boundaries Commission, can also make good decisions. And I look forward to speaking with you again next week. Thank you.